Hey guys, so this is going to be part 2 of my 3-part guide. Part 1 being about the talents, this part being about the priority list, which is often referred to as a rotation, and part 3 going to be about gearing. Gearing one coming a little later just to make sure everything's a little more accurate, but this information we're pretty confident with. So there's going to be a lot to look at on this page, so don't worry too much if you get a little confused. I will be showing some in-game examples and trying to go through a little bit to make things feel a little more simple at the end. Let's go through the raw data here of like what is actually the best in order of like what you should be casting, otherwise known as a priority list. So you can kind of select which builds you want, and things will change. But we're going to be starting with the normal single target build that we talked about in the talents, the normal one that you'd actually be running in majority of fights. So top of the list is refreshing totem mastery if you are out of range of it, or it is no longer active, as if it expires. Then of course you want to be using your cooldowns as often as possible, unless you're saving it specifically for a certain part of the fight. Keep Flame Shock up at 100% of the time, pretty much straight from the opener. You never want this to fall off. Refresh it if it's not active, refresh it if it's at 7 seconds or lower, because that is the pandemic range. You will not lose any duration if you refresh it at 7 seconds or lower. And if you are in Storm Elemental, do not refresh it if you have over 14 stacks of Wind Gust. Generally, before going into Storm Elemental, you want to refresh Flame Shock immediately before going into Storm Elemental, so you can then just spam your Lightning Bolts and Earth Shocks without needing to worry about that extra global. But we'll get a little more into that in a bit. Number 4 is Stormkeeper. You want to ideally game this with Surge of Power and stuff, but we'll look at that a little more when we get to the Surge of Power part. But just keep Stormkeeper on cooldown as much as you can, unless you're saving it for a large AoE pull, or a large AoE part of the fight. If there are 2 or more targets, you want to be using Earthquake as your spender instead of Earth Shock. Now, if Lightning Bolt, if Stormkeeper is active, below the spender. Now, there are going to be some extra things that we'll look at a little bit, but there's nothing to actually min-max with Stormkeeper on this current talent setup. Now, Earth Shock, personally, I would put Earth Shock here being at 92 or more Maelstrom. And the lower you get, we'll add another Earth Shock line, but just for simplicity's sake, I don't think they wanted a whole bunch of Earth Shock lines, because technically there could be like 10, I think, if you really wanted to put all these different little conditionals and stuff. But here we got Earth Shock. It's high Maelstrom if you need to worry about overcapping Earth Shock on one target, Earthquake on 2 or more. Lightning Bolt if Storm Elemental is active. So Lightning Bolt over Lava Burst, keep that in mind. Even if you have a Lava Surge proc, Lightning Bolt is still superior. Lava Burst with Surge of Power if you get another use of Storm Elemental. I'm actually not sure why this one's on the non-Surge of Power section, but that is something that I kind of want to talk about as well. The main thing with Surge of Power rotation is knowing when to use Lava Burst and knowing when to use Lightning Bolt, and I might actually make a video entirely based on that in itself once I learn how to actually maximize this. And by learn how, I mean once I properly do it in a raid, I'm going to try for sure next week. This week I didn't use it because I wanted to get the kill times down. But moving on from that, below this is just Lava Burst in general. Of course, below Lightning Bolt and Storm Elemental is active, but above Lightning Bolt without Storm Elemental. Below that is, if you have nothing else to do, and your Totem Mastery is getting low, just refresh it, just to make sure you don't end up overlapping something else with having the Totem Mastery run out and end up losing like a Lava Burst use or something. Lightning Bolt as a filler, and then if you are moving, you just put Frost Shock as your filler. Of course, if you're moving, you can refresh Flame Shock or Earth Shock instead, but you can't do any of those. Frost Shock is where that comes in. So now let's compare the changes of this build to some other popular builds you might play. So here, you might play Surge of Power. The main thing that you'd want to min-max with Surge of Power would be buffing both the Lightning Bolts from your Stormkeeper. Then of course, if you can get an extra Elemental use out, you would want to use Lava Burst on your Surge of Power to get that out. The way you actually do buff your Stormkeeper with Surge of Power is you gotta get to 96 or higher Maelstrom, an Earth Shock, Stormkeeper, in any order, Lightning Bolt to consume the first buff. You have to have a Lava Burst ready to generate some Maelstrom, unless you get really lucky with the overloads on the first Lightning Bolt, but you shouldn't really try to rely on that, so go try to hold a Lava Burst if you can. Lava Burst will give you enough Maelstrom to Earth Shock again, and then you can Lightning Bolt on the second charge. So you can get a ton of damage if you get extra overloads here, both empowered by Stormkeeper, so That's definitely something you want to try to do outside of the very first Stormkeeper of the fight. The very first one you just want to use before the pull. But that is something throughout the fight you should be trying to do. Now, Master of the Elements and Icefury is another build you can look at here. Primary changes here is, since you can't have Master of the Elements and Surge of Power at the same time. Generally, you won't. So, if you don't have Surge of Power, I guess if you have them both, you would prioritize Surge of Power on your Stormkeeper charges. But otherwise, you do want to try to buff your Stormkeeper charges with Master of the Elements, if at all possible. And I'll be showing some in-game examples of this in a little bit too. But so that is the most powerful thing you can buff with most. So make sure to try to do that. Just below Earthshock at high Maelstrom is Frostshock with the Ice Fury buff and Master of the Elements active. Below that, Lava Burst, and then just Frostshock with Ice Fury buff. Also a nice Maelstrom generator. What I personally did to make sure I could buff the Stormkeeper, on pull at least, is I would just fill with the Frostshocks until I got the another Lava Burst, and I'd buff that. But again, I'll show that a little more in depth in a little bit. But just giving an example of when the rotation might change a little to work around what you have in front of you. But this is general rotation. This Frostshock with Ice Fury, cast Ice Fury on cooldown, rush Totem Mastery as you normally would, and everything else is normal. Now, I don't think there's anything else that really changes. Aftershock doesn't really change anything. All the Thunder doesn't really change anything. Elemental Blast is just a high priority spell. If you're not in Storm Elemental, if you're in Storm Elemental, you don't actually want to use it. But if you could cast a Master of the Elements with Earthshock, that's the only time you would not want to cast Elemental Blast ahead of pretty much everything else. Because Elemental Blast is worse than an Earthshock, so you don't want to buff that with the Master of the Elements, so you'd rather spend that on the Earthshock first. But otherwise, Master of the Elements is a pretty high priority spell there. Ascendance, normal stuff. If you don't want to stack this with Storm Elemental at all anymore. Storm Elemental is too powerful with the Lightning Bolt. You want to spread them if at all possible. And then you also want to dump your Lava Burst charges before popping Ascendance. And you don't want Ice Fury up because you don't want to stack those. Unless you know there's movement coming or something, I guess you could try to do something with that, but I probably would avoid doing that. And I think that sums it up, except for Liquid Magma Totem, which is just another high priority cooldown spell. Echo the Elements doesn't really change anything. But so that is the basic rotation on paper. And we're going to go into some of the more specifics right now. So here we have an actual list of best to worst things to buff with Master of the Elements, which is not as complicated to think of as you might think. Basically just whatever does the most actual damage. The Earthquake on 2 or more targets is the actual best thing to buff. Then it's an Empowered Lightning Bolt from Stormkeeper. Then it is an Earthshock. Then it's a Frostshock from Ice Fury. Lightning Bolt, Ice Fury. Unfortunately, Ice Fury itself is actually weaker than a Lightning Bolt. And then just an unbuffed Frostshock. Now I'm curious, if I turn this over to Elemental Blast, will that add this? It does not, so I could just look at the actual damage here and just tell you right now. 63%, that would go below Lightning Bolt and above Ice Fury if you have Elemental Blast. So don't really buff Elemental Blast very much. That's a very weak damage spell. It's all about the buffs you get. Now, with Storm Elemental and Elemental Blast, if for some reason you have 3 natural harmonies, like a Mythic Plus or something, and you're running Elemental Blast and Storm Elemental, and you have them both up at the same time, you do want to keep using Elemental Blast until 14 stacks of Wind Gust, so keep that in mind. That is one exception to that rule. And here we already talked about this. Surge of Power on 2 targets, as long as both targets don't have Flame Shock, or they are in the Pandemic range, and also in Spread range. Use Earthshock once to spread the Flame Shock before going into Earthquake. So keep that in mind. And just in case you did miss the part up here where it says 1 or 2 targets, Lightning Bolt as a filler is actually on 2 targets now as well, so don't be using Chain Lightning on 2 targets anymore. For 3 or more targets, Totem Mastery, keep that up as much as you can. Use your Elementals, maintain that Flame Shocks on up to 3 targets. Earthquake, whenever available, try to game it with Master of the Elements. If you're fighting 3 targets with your Lava Surge procs, you can try to get the Earthquake down. Lava Burst to consume Lava Surge procs on 3 targets. Never hard cast a Lava Burst, only the procs. And don't even use the procs if Storm Elemental is active. Instead, you just want to use the Chain Lightning and Earthquake. Elemental Blast up to 3 targets, not on 4 or more. And then just Chain Lightning as a filler. Now, special mention to Flame Shock here, because it actually is technically worth it at 4 targets if you can maintain them all. But there are very few situations in the game where there are 4 targets that will all live long enough to survive a full cycle of Flame Shock applications, so we decided to leave 3 as the suggestion. But if you are ever in a situation where it's like a raid boss with 4 targets that are all going to last the entire duration, do go ahead and Flame Shock them all. It is a technical increase. And I'm going to show you my personal favorite opener. Openers are kind of like a little nitpicky thing that don't really increase damage or decrease damage all that much. I don't really like the one on Stormwrath and Lava, if I'm being completely honest, but I also know that it doesn't really make a difference. But I'm going to show you what I personally like to do because it feels better. Not necessarily more or less damage, but it feels better. So I have found my way into the game to show you this. But basically, Stormkeeper before the pull can be up to like 10 seconds before the pull without actually really losing anything. So I would recommend doing that pretty early because you can get a lot out of it. Stormkeeper being a pretty good single target cooldown now. Let's say you're pulling 15 pulls at 15-second pull timer at 10 seconds-ish. You'd want to Stormkeeper. Sitting here waiting a minute at like 3 or 4 seconds.
5,
you want to do
4,
totems.
3,
Here's your potion.
2,
start casting Lava Burst.
1.
Did a little early. Flame Shock while it's in the air. Normally pop all your cooldowns, use the lightning bolts, and then just go ham with lightning bolts the entire time. Unfortunately, I have my PvP action bars right now, so I couldn't actually potion. But you want to precast lightning bolt or lava burst depending on your cast time. Mine being 1.7 seconds, you want to cast it at like 2. Does have a bit of a travel time. But be careful because you do need to apply the flame shock before it actually hits the target, or it will not crit. You don't want to flame shock early and pull the boss before everyone's ready, so careful with the precast. Precasting is always kind of dangerous. If you're not comfortable doing that, then don't worry about it. It's really not the biggest thing. You can just flame shock on pull, lava burst, and then pop Storm Ellie. Not really a big deal. So there's a little section on the website on the rotation page for like common mistakes, common misconceptions, things people generally ask about. So feel free to check that out, but I'm not going to go over all of them in this video since they are all pretty minor stuff that not everyone's going to be wondering about. So if anything strikes your interest here, make sure to go check it out on the website. So now that we've gone over everything I can really show on the website and everything, I wanted to go into the gameplay side of things. We're going to be showing 2 separate VODs. I'm not going to go over the whole kill, but this one where I'm using Storm Elemental Primal Elementalist build, and then another one where I was using Icefury and Master of the Elements. Though I only have one of those, so I'm not sure quite how high quality it is, but if nothing else, I can critique my own play and tell you what not to do. But on this one, kind of gives you an idea of like the decision making that kind of goes into Storm Ellie and stuff like that. So go ahead and play this. That is with sound on. Did not mean to do that. Go ahead and play this. In the opener, I got stunned, but also I wanted to say that I did my opener a little late. I was distracted or something, but you can see I did the opener I showed in the video. I'm holding Eye of the Storm for the ad to come because I don't want to waste it on one target. Then I end up getting stunned. I use Thunderstorm because I'm stunned and want to do more damage. I use Eye of the Storm anyway. I continue using Lightning Bolt on 2 targets. That is a new rotation. Here I'm kind of pooling a bit. There's no real technical reason to pool there. Doesn't really matter. You just Earth Shock and Lightning Bolt anyway. At this point, I was pooling a little more because I wanted to drop an Earthquake at the very last second because an ab was about to spawn. And also, as you get towards the end of your Storm Ellie, if you could get away with pooling up to 100, that is actually better. I guess not up to 100, but up to too close to 100. You get more Lightning Bolts in without really losing anything. But just a reminder on 2 target Earthquake now with Lightning Bolt instead of Chain Lightning. Well, that's like a little peek at what goes into decision making in high paced environment. I guess it's only Heroic Vectis, but same as Mythic Vectis pretty much. Okay, so here is a Mithrax Heroic kill that I'm not going to show the whole kill of, in a pug that I did where I used Icefury, Master of the Elements, and Stormkeeper. And I definitely didn't play it perfectly, but there's a lot of things to take note of here. So first off, I should have used Stormkeeper up here before jumping down. I just didn't think about it. Could have gotten potentially another use in. But first thing I do, apply Flame Shock, summon the Elemental, use cooldown, Stormkeeper, Lava Burst to buff the first Lightning Bolt. Then I use Icefury, I get a Lava Burst proc during the Icefury. Going too fast for me to talk. I used Icefury there because I didn't have a Lava Burst yet and I wanted to buff the other charge of Stormkeeper, so I used Icefury first. Lava Surge proc happened during the Icefury cast, so I straight out of the Icefury cast, I used the Lava Surge, used my other Stormkeeper Lightning Bolt. And then I used Earth Shock to my Maelstrom, buff some Icefury charges instead of Earth Shocking there. I decided to Frost Shock instead, hoping I would get another Lava Surge proc so I could buff my Earth Shock, but it did not happen. But either way, I'm not really losing anything by doing that, so it was worth doing overall. Use my last one, Lightning Bolt, got Lava Burst back. Hard to talk this fast, got my Lava Burst back, buffed the Earth Shock with it. Didn't have quite enough to buff Earth Shock, so I'm going to hold my Earth Shock a little bit here, see if I can get something out of it. I decided it's not worth overcapping at all for, so dump the Maelstrom. Hope I get something out of this too. Didn't get an overload, so didn't get anything out of that. But dump my Maelstrom. I actually should have dumped my Maelstrom there because I overcapped by 5, but either way. Frost Shock, Frost Shock. I had to dump there, didn't get a Lava Surge proc. All comes down to like trying to buff things, but not overcommitting to it. That's kind of the name of the game here. Somehow out of my Totem Mastery range there. So Stormkeeper's coming back up, and I don't have Icefury this time, which is a little bit awkward. Got to buff a nice Earth Shock there. It's kind of hard to figure out how much to benefit from it. I got a Lava Surge proc, which is kind of convenient. Into an Earth Shock, and then Icefury's coming back up, and here's where I kind of choke. I freeze. I just stop for like 3 seconds. And I probably should have just used the charge. I just stopped, got the Icefury up, started dumping with that, and got the Lava Surge proc and buffed the Stormkeeper. I actually don't know if that's worth or not. I feel like downtime like that probably isn't really worth it. Even if instead of just freezing like that, I just use like Frost Shock or something, anything to fill that gap would have been good. Here I get to buff another Earth Shock. I end up holding a little bit, and then I ended up using it. I think I was, like in my head as I had spawning, I was going to buff with Earthquake, but of course there was only one ad, so it didn't work out that way. But here we got potential ads coming, so I'm hoping to pool some Maelstrom here. End up getting close to cap, got to dump a little bit. I'm hoping to get enough Maelstrom to start dropping some Earthquakes that are buffed. This got Essence Sheared almost. I'll buff that, but I don't have any Maelstrom to actually do it, so gonna build here real quick. Stormkeeper coming up again, so I probably want to buff the Earthquakes over the Stormkeeper. Had to run away from the beam. I have a buff. I ended up using an Earthquake. Or actually, no, I used an Earth Shock. Then I have Stormkeeper up. There I made a mistake, a pretty big one. Immediately when I pop Stormkeeper... Where'd it go? I pop Stormkeeper here. I got a Lava Surge proc. But I didn't notice it in time, so I ended up spending the Stormkeeper before the Lava Surge proc, and I had Icefury come up. I could have definitely buffed both those Stormkeeper charges if I had waited and used that Lava Surge proc first. I just didn't notice it quite in time before queuing up the spell. Unfortunate there. Your Fire Lilies come back up. I got multi-dotting out, so that's kind of a nice situation for Fire Lily. And I finally use it here. Now I have a buff. I probably could have used an Earthquake and had the boss get run on top of it, so I definitely should have done that. But little things like that, the little decisions you make in the fight do add up pretty quick. Put an Earthquake down. I could have gotten a couple ticks on those 2 mobs and on the boss from there. But that is just a little example of the very quick, fast-paced decision-making that goes into the Icefury Master of the Elements build. You have so many things to buff and only so many buffs to go around. Certain priorities happen. You have to think pretty quick on what you're going to do and have to plan a bit ahead on pooling Maelstrom and stuff. But I find it really enjoyable. It's definitely one of the harder talent setups in the game right now. But that's kind of the reason I like it. Like there, actually, another mistake I just caught. I pop Stormkeeper here. I use the first charge, which is fine. Then I Earth Shock, and Lava Burst is almost off cooldown, and Totem Mastery has 11 seconds. I should have refreshed Totem Mastery, used the Lava Burst, and then buffed the Stormkeeper charge. It's amazing how if you go back and watch your own videos, you notice just how much you're doing wrong. And a lot of people may not think I was doing much wrong because of my damage being so much higher than the rest of the group, but even if you're doing really well, you can still be making a lot of mistakes. So that is a nice little taste of what this build could look like in action. It's pretty intense, but it's a lot of fun. Alright guys, I think that's about all I can really say about the priority list. If you liked the video, make sure you leave a like so I know. Subscribe if you want to see more, and be on the lookout for my gear part of the guide, part 3, coming soon. And also coming soon, old gear guide. If you want to see the basic suggestions, you can go on the website, of course, but I'll be going into a lot more detail about why I suggest what I suggest in this guide on a video coming sometime later this week as well. So again, thanks guys for watching. If you guys enjoyed, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.